The year 1877 arrived as a turning point in the American South, though not one of peace or prosperity. It was the year when Reconstruction came to an end, when federal troops withdrew, and when Mississippi was left to govern itself once again. The scars of the Civil War had not healed, and the soil of the Delta was still heavy with grief, poverty, and resentment. Plantations once rich with cotton stood in ruin, their fields overgrown, their grand houses reduced to decay. Freedmen tried to carve out new lives, but chains of debt and violence bound them almost as tightly as slavery once had. For poor white families like the Hargroves of Yazoo County, survival was little more than a daily calculation, a struggle between hunger and faith. Life in Mississippi was haunted by superstition and shadow. Churches preached fire and brimstone, warning of God's wrath on a land corrupted by sin. In the swamps and pine thickets, whispers of conjure men and root workers persisted, carrying with them a blend of African traditions and frontier magic. It was a place where fate and faith seemed interchangeable, and where any misfortune, a failed crop, a stillborn child, a sudden storm, was taken as divine judgment. In 1877, families clung to survival by their fingernails, and those born different were seldom viewed as innocent. They were considered omens, harbingers, punishments made flesh. The collapse of Reconstruction also brought the return of old powers. Politicians who once cried defeat now held office again, and militias patrolled the countryside with cruelty and certainty. Violence against freedmen was a daily terror, carried out under the cloak of night or in broad daylight without consequence. Lynchings became public rituals, a way of reasserting control in a fractured society. The Hargrove family lived within this tense, choking atmosphere, where neighbors trusted little and strangers even less. Mississippi was no longer a battlefield of armies, but of ideas, fears, and survival, and every household bore the weight of uncertainty. For families already struggling, the birth of children was both a blessing and a risk. Infant mortality was high and medical care was primitive, often administered by midwives with little more than herbs, prayers, and experience. The arrival of Lydia and Clara Hargrove, conjoined at the hip, stunned their small community. Word spread quickly through Yazoo County, and some saw the children as a sign that Mississippi's sins still cried out from the earth. In a land starved for explanations, 1877 was not a year of progress. It was a year of reckoning. The Siamese Sisters would carry that burden from the moment of their first breath. The atmosphere of Mississippi in that year cannot be understood without reckoning with its decay. Roads washed out with spring rains, towns barely lit by lantern light, and families often lived with their dead in the form of unmarked graves scattered across homesteads. Hunger was common, and epidemics swept through without warning. Families relied on the church, not only for salvation, but for social order and the promise that God had not abandoned them. Yet beneath the sermons, fear lingered. People turned to folklore when faith failed, whispering of curses, hauntings, and spirits that refused to rest. For a family like the Hargroves, whose daughters embodied what many believed to be unnatural, this atmosphere would shape every moment of their lives. Thus, the year 1877 was not simply a date on a calendar, but a crucible of despair and transformation. Mississippi was a state searching for its soul, caught between the ashes of the old world and the uncertainties of the new. The end of Reconstruction did not heal wounds. It deepened them, carving fear and superstition deeper into the marrow of its people. In this haunted landscape of swamp and ruin, the story of Lydia and Clara Hargrove could not have been born in any other time, for it was a year when the line between divine judgment and human cruelty had all but vanished. The Mississippi Delta in the late 19th century was a place of contrasts, fertile and cursed all at once. The soil was among the richest in America, black and damp, capable of yielding endless cotton when worked by tireless hands. Yet that same land carried a weight of blood and toil, for every field had been carved by enslaved labor, every row of cotton a reminder of chains that only recently had been broken. The swamps pressed close against the edges of farmland, filled with cypress knees jutting from the dark water like bones, and mosquitoes swarmed in clouds thick enough to choke. Towns clung to the edges of rivers and trading routes, places where markets and gossip collided, but beyond them stretched miles of wilderness where families lived in isolation, cut off from the world and surrounded by a silence broken only by the calls of whip-poor-wills and the rustle of unseen creatures. Life in the Delta was ruled as much by superstition as by hard fact. It was said that the river carried secrets, that those who disappeared into its depths were never gone, but simply swallowed whole, their spirits floating downstream to trouble those still living. Families told stories around firelight of ghosts wandering the levees, of women in white walking the swamp roads, and of children who never belonged to this earth. Such beliefs thrived because the Delta itself seemed alive, its storms sudden, its floods merciless, its very air heavy with menace. In that suffocating atmosphere, anything unnatural, any difference, any abnormality was quickly branded as a curse, an omen sent to test the faithful or condemn the sinful. For the Hargroves, raising two daughters joined in flesh, there could be no escape from the judgment that the land itself seemed to echo. The isolation of the region meant families relied more on whispers and imagination than on science. Doctors were scarce, their knowledge limited, and in many towns the local preacher held more sway than any physician. When Lydia and Clara were carried into church as infants, heads turned away, and mothers pulled their children close, afraid that even looking too long might invite misfortune. On the farms and in the swamps, word spread faster than the river's current, and before long the sisters' existence was spoken of as if it were a parable. Some said they were proof of God's wrath on Mississippi, a punishment for a land steeped in blood. Others whispered darker tales, claiming their very birth had been marked by the devil's hand. In such a setting, the Delta became not just a home, but a stage upon which fear and faith twisted into something dangerous. The Delta's economy added another layer of tension. By 1877, the cotton fields were still worked tirelessly, though now by freedmen bound through sharecropping contracts that left them no better than slaves in debt. White families, too, fell into poverty, watching their land erode while creditors in distant cities took what little profit they could scrape together. Hunger gnawed at households and desperation bred cruelty. To many, the existence of the Hargrove sisters was a reminder of their own failures, a reflection of a land that had lost its blessing. When a cow died unexpectedly, or when a flood washed away seed, it was not uncommon for neighbors to mutter the sisters' names, blaming them for events beyond their control. They became living scapegoats in a region always searching for explanations to cover its miseries. The natural environment mirrored the human condition. The Mississippi River flooded unpredictably, drowning homes and sweeping away entire plots of farmland. Snakes slid silently through flooded fields, and the night sounds of the Delta, owl calls, frogs, insects, took on a sinister edge when paired with human fears. Families spoke of hearing cries at night carried on the wind, and when livestock grew sick or infants died in their cradles, it was never just bad fortune. It was the Delta itself, punishing those who had displeased it. For Lydia and Clara, whose very bodies challenged nature's rules, this constant undercurrent of suspicion made them not simply children, but embodiments of dread woven into the fabric of their county's folklore. The Mississippi Delta of 1877 was therefore more than a setting. It was a living, breathing force, shaping the destiny of those trapped within its muddy grip. Every field of cotton was a monument to past suffering, every swamp a reminder of hidden dangers, and every small community a web of whispers where suspicion grew like kudzu. For the Hargrove family, their daughter's existence was magnified by this landscape, turned from a private struggle into a public horror, a story the land itself seemed eager to tell through storms, sickness, and silence. The pact itself was born not in a single night, but in years of resentment, shame, and desperation that clung to the Hargrove sisters like the damp air of the Mississippi Delta. Lydia, the quieter of the two, carried her Bible with trembling hands, whispering prayers each morning and evening, believing their fused flesh was a test from God, a burden meant to be endured with faith. Clara, sharper in tongue and harder in gaze, saw no blessing in their condition. Where Lydia found solace in Scripture, Clara found only bitterness, mocking sermons and scorning neighbors who dared to stare. They lived in a house where silence lingered longer than laughter, where the parents prayed for miracles that never came, and where the daughters' bodies bound them in ways no human soul could tolerate for long. Out of this tension, the idea of a pact grew, a whispered agreement made in shadows where no one else could hear. The promise was simple yet horrifying. Neither sister would live without the other. Lydia spoke of sacrifice, insisting that their souls, inseparable in flesh, must remain united in eternity, even if death came first to one. Clara's reasons were colder, laced with rage rather than faith. She claimed she would rather drag her sister into the grave than endure the pitying stares and hushed accusations alone. Each had her own justification, yet both agreed, for in their twisted bond, fear of abandonment outweighed the dread of death. The pact was not written nor spoken aloud to their family, but it lingered in the air of their small room, carried in their glances, carved into their breathing rhythm when they lay awake at night. As the years passed, the pact became their unholy tether. Arguments ended with reminders of it, Clara's harsh whisper or Lydia's trembling plea, both invoking the same dreadful promise. They cut their fingers once, mingling blood in a ritual that felt older than themselves, sealing what words could not. From that moment, the pact was no longer an idea, but a living vow, pulsing with the same blood that coursed between their joined bodies. Lydia convinced herself it was sanctified, a covenant that heaven would honor. Clara believed it was a defiance, a refusal to let fate or faith dictate their destiny. The meaning differed, but the result was the same, a bond that threatened to destroy them from within. The Hargrove household grew uneasy as the sisters aged. Their mother claimed she heard them whispering long into the night, voices low, arguments simmering before falling into an eerie silence. Their father, worn down by poverty and guilt, avoided their room altogether. Neighbors noticed too. Some said they saw the sisters wandering near the family plot at dusk, pausing by the graves of those long dead, speaking as if in consultation with spirits. Others swore that when one of the girls was seen in town, the other's eyes seemed distant, almost hollow, as if half her soul was already gone. Though no outsider could prove it, the sense of something ominous clung to them like the shadows of the swamps. In the autumn of their 18th year, illness crept into the Hargrove household. Lydia fell into fever first, her prayers turning frantic, her lips dry and cracked as she clutched at the crucifix around her neck. Clara, though weakened by the shared body, remained strangely alert, watching her sister's decline with a mixture of fear and fury. It was during these nights, when their mother dozed in exhaustion and their father drank to silence his despair, that the pact returned with urgency. Lydia, pale and delirious, whispered of heaven waiting for them both. Clara, trembling yet resolute, reminded her that no promise made in blood could be broken without consequence. Each night the pact grew heavier, pressing down on their shared frame until it felt less like a choice and more like a command written into their very being. When the end finally came, it was swift and terrible. Lydia's body succumbed first, her breath slowing into stillness as dawn crept across the fields. Clara, bound to her in flesh, felt the weight of her sister's death before anyone else entered the room. For a single moment, witnesses would later claim she cried out not in sorrow but in rage, her face twisted as though she were fighting something unseen. What happened in that room, only the sisters truly knew. But when their mother finally found them, one lay cold with prayer on her lips, while the other's wide, staring eyes carried the unmistakable mark of strangled breath, as if the pact itself had reached out and claimed her life. The Hargrove sisters, Lydia and Clara, were unlike any other children born in Yazoo County, for their bodies had been fused from the very moment of birth, joined at the hip and lower spine, forced to share organs and the slow rhythm of one heart. Their mother wept when she first saw them, torn between love and horror, and their father stood in stunned silence, unable to decide whether the strange children were a curse or a punishment. In those years, medicine offered little hope, and such births were viewed not through science but through superstition. And soon the whispers began, traveling across the county like wildfire. Some neighbors refused to look upon them at all, crossing themselves when they passed the Hargrove farm, while others came only to stare, paying coins just to glimpse the two small faces that blinked in unison from one fragile frame. The sisters grew beneath this scrutiny, learning early that they were not seen as daughters but as an omen carved into flesh. Bound together in a body that was never entirely theirs, the girls experienced the world with no privacy, no solitude, no moment apart. Every movement was shared, every step negotiated, every breath a reminder of the other's presence. Lydia leaned into faith to cope, clutching at verses and believing their condition was a divine trial to be endured with grace, while Clara hardened, refusing to accept any notion of mercy in their existence. This difference grew sharper with age, yet neither could escape the other, forced by the very design of their bodies to share every hunger, every illness, every restless night. The world beyond their home treated them as spectacle, and their father, desperate for income, displayed them at county fairs and carnivals where men and women pointed, whispered, and gawked as though they were animals behind glass. Each coin tossed at their feet deepened Clara's resentment, while Lydia prayed silently that God might forgive the cruelty of the crowd. The burden of being Siamese twins in a time so drenched in superstition weighed heavily on the family. Doctors in nearby towns offered little more than pity, and some even refused to examine the sisters, declaring their lives unnatural and best left to Providence. Clergymen debated in hushed tones whether the girls carried a single soul or two, as if theology could untangle the sinews that bound them. Children their age kept their distance, frightened by stories told at the hearths of their parents, stories that painted the sisters as harbingers of storms or as living proof that God's patience with Mississippi had reached its end. Their lives became less that of ordinary children and more that of legend in the making, their bodies inscribed with meaning they had never chosen. Within the walls of their home, life carried its own torment. The sisters bickered endlessly, the smallest disagreement amplified by the impossibility of space between them. Lydia, determined to see their suffering as holy, begged her sister to repent and seek God's mercy, while Clara spat bitter words, mocking prayers and daring curses upon the land. Their parents lived in constant dread of what the future might hold, praying not for prosperity, but for peace within the walls of their house. Yet even peace seemed impossible, for the sisters' condition meant every sickness spread instantly, every exhaustion doubled, every fear echoed. It was a life of entanglement so profound that even their thoughts began to mirror one another, a cruel binding of flesh and spirit that allowed no rest. The people of Yazoo County never let the sisters forget their difference. Strangers arrived unannounced at the Hargrove farm, asking to see them, some out of pity, some out of morbid fascination. Their father's decision to exhibit them for money ensured that their reputation spread far beyond the county, and before long they were known in nearby towns as the Siamese Sisters of Mississippi, a name spoken with both fascination and dread. To some they were curiosities worth a dime, a brief diversion from the poverty that plagued the region. To others they were an abomination, proof that sin still lingered in the blood of the South. The sisters themselves, caught between these roles, became both performers and prisoners, living their lives in the space between ridicule and fear. By the time they reached their 18th year, Lydia and Clara were no longer simply children born with a strange condition, but symbols upon which their community projected every fear, every superstition, and every question of faith. They were not allowed to exist as individuals, but instead as a single spectacle, a reminder that nature and divinity could both be cruel. Their joined bodies made every simple act a trial, every glance from a neighbor a judgment, and every whispered rumor another nail in the coffin of their innocence. The burden of being Siamese sisters was not merely the strain of flesh and bone, but the weight of an entire community's imagination pressing down upon them, shaping their existence into a story that would outlive their fragile fused bodies. Lydia and Clara's lives were not only bound by the flesh that held them together, but by the war between belief and denial that raged within their small shared body. Lydia clung to Scripture as though it were the only raft in a flood, whispering psalms under her breath, tracing verses with trembling fingers, and begging heaven for mercy on nights when their fused frame ached with fevers. She believed with absolute certainty that their condition was God's test, a sacred burden laid upon them to teach endurance, humility, and devotion. Clara, by contrast, spit on those very ideas, sneering at the preachers who spoke of divine justice and mocking her sisters' prayers when they rose from their bed in the still hours of night. For Clara, their joined existence was proof not of a higher purpose but of cruelty, evidence that no just God could fashion such torment and call it holy. Their conversations often turned into battles, whispered arguments in the darkness. Lydia insisting on grace, Clara refusing to accept anything but rage. The household trembled under this constant tension, their mother torn between the two voices that spoke with one breath, their father retreating into silence and drink. Lydia asked to be brought to church each Sunday, desperate to sit beneath the cross and feel the weight of faith pressing down on her. Clara went reluctantly, scowling through hymns, scoffing at sermons, her sharp tongue whispering curses in her sister's ear, even as the congregation bowed their heads in reverence. Where Lydia saw sanctuary, Clara saw hypocrisy, and every prayer only deepened her contempt. This clash created a divide that could never be resolved, for neither could walk away, neither could choose solitude, and so their bond became a battlefield of belief, a struggle not just of the spirit, but of survival itself. Their neighbors fed this conflict with their own whispers. Some spoke kindly of Lydia's piety, calling her the only reason the girls were spared God's wrath thus far, while others muttered that Clara's defiance was what doomed them both. When storms swept across the delta, flattening fields and drowning cattle, some blamed Clara's disbelief, declaring her wickedness drew heaven's anger upon the county. Others, fearful of condemning a child, whispered instead that Lydia's constant prayers must be keeping worse destruction at bay. The twins became both saints and sinners in the same breath, symbols for whatever fear or faith their neighbors chose to hold. In this way, their private conflict was magnified by the world around them, the land itself seeming to join the argument with every flood, every drought, every whisper of wind across the swamp. The sisters' shared body made their differences impossible to ignore. Lydia crossed herself before each meal, murmuring blessings that Clara refused to repeat. When one prayed, the other rolled her eyes. When Lydia begged for forgiveness, Clara muttered that no forgiveness was needed. These small, defiant gestures grew heavier with time, until each moment together became a reminder of their irreconcilable worldviews. They could not turn away, could not walk out of the room, could not retreat to silence, for their bond of flesh held them fast, forcing each to endure the other's faith or scorn. It was not merely a debate of words, but a daily torment, an endless cycle of prayer answered with laughter, devotion met with blasphemy, until even their breathing seemed to carry two different rhythms, one steady with faith, the other restless with fury. This clash deepened in the years when their father took them to fairs and exhibitions. Lydia bowed her head, ashamed of the gawking eyes, believing she was being punished for some hidden sin, while Clara relished the anger it stirred, feeding her hatred for the faith that allowed such humiliation. She mocked the audiences under her breath, calling them hypocrites who claimed to love God but paid coins to stare at suffering. Lydia wept quietly on those journeys, clutching her Bible even tighter, believing it was the only thing that kept them from being consumed by the cruelty of men. Their pact, whispered years earlier, grew stronger under these conditions, for Clara insisted no God would save them, and Lydia, fearing the emptiness of a life without her sister, agreed that if death came for one, it must come for both. By the autumn of 1877, the divide between them had reached a breaking point. Lydia prayed more fervently than ever, convinced that salvation was near, while Clara's laughter turned hollow, her bitterness sharpening into something darker. They had become, in the eyes of their family and their community, not just sisters, but the embodiment of an argument that could never be resolved. Faith and doubt locked in a body that would not let go. Every whispered prayer, every muttered curse, every clash of conviction added weight to the pact they carried, until it no longer felt like a promise, but an inevitability waiting for its hour. The night of their final hours was thick with autumn damp, the air heavy with the smell of earth and decaying leaves, and inside the Hargrove home the sisters lay restless upon their narrow bed, the flicker of a single lantern throwing long shadows against the walls. Lydia, weakened by fever, clutched the small wooden crucifix that had rarely left her hand since childhood, her lips moving in silent prayer, while Clara sat rigid beside her, eyes wide and hollow, her breath uneven, as though she already sensed what was coming. Their mother dozed in a chair at the far side of the room, exhausted from days of tending to them, while their father sat downstairs, drinking quietly, unwilling to face the sounds of sickness that echoed through the wooden floorboards. The silence between the sisters was broken only by Lydia's soft murmurings and Clara's occasional sharp exhale, a rhythm of devotion and defiance that had defined them all their lives. When the fever broke shortly before dawn, Lydia's body gave in to stillness, her face pale, her chest rising only in shallow breaths that grew fainter with each passing moment. Clara, bound to her in flesh, felt the change immediately, the shared weight of their hearts staggering as one half of their union began to fade. She shook her sister's shoulder, called her name, but Lydia's eyes remained closed, her lips frozen in prayer, as though she had already slipped beyond the reach of the room. The terror in Clara's expression told the story no one could speak, for the pact they had sealed in blood years before now loomed like a shadow above the bed, demanding to be fulfilled. Clara's hands trembled as she realized the vow was no longer an idea, but an unrelenting command, and though her body still clung to life, Her soul was being dragged into the grave with her sister. Their mother stirred awake at the sound of movement, and for a moment she thought both girls were sleeping, until she saw the stiff set of Clara's jaw, the way her eyes seemed to fix upon something unseen. She rushed forward, shaking Lydia, weeping when she found her daughter's body cold, yet her cries turned to horror when she noticed Clara's strangled breaths, the veins in her neck straining as though invisible hands had closed around her throat. She screamed for Amos, who stumbled into the room reeking of whiskey, his eyes going wide at the sight of both his daughters fading before him, one already gone, the other convulsing in what seemed like the grip of some unseen force. He could do nothing but kneel beside the bed, his hands hovering helplessly, for no doctor could be fetched in time, and no prayer could undo the pact that had already claimed them. When both sisters lay still, the silence that filled the room was so complete that even the night sounds outside seemed to vanish. The parents sat in stunned disbelief, unable to comprehend how two lives could vanish in a single breath, bound together not only by flesh but by a promise spoken in whispers and sealed in blood. Word of the event spread quickly through the county, carried from farm to farm, until the story of the Hargrove twins' death became more than a tragedy. It became a legend. The coroner, when summoned, refused to record the details plainly, scribbling only that the cause was complications of nature, unwilling to place into writing the suggestion of strangulation, unwilling to acknowledge the possibility that one sister had dragged the other into death's grasp. The church, when asked for burial, turned the family away, declaring that such an end was not holy, that the ground of consecrated cemeteries could not hold bodies marked by blasphemy and bound by such a vow. The preacher, speaking sternly, claimed their deaths were evidence of sin, a pact with forces darker than God, and he urged the Hargroves to bury their daughters quietly, away from the view of the congregation. And so, with shame pressing heavier than grief, Amos and Ruth dug a shallow grave on their own land, lowering the fused bodies into the soil, while the wind howled through the trees as if mocking their sorrow. There was no hymn, no benediction, only the sound of dirt striking wood and the silence of parents who had lost everything. In the weeks that followed, neighbors spoke of strange happenings near the Hargrove farm. Some claimed to hear faint cries carried on the night wind, voices overlapping, one soft with prayer, the other sharp with defiance, echoing across the fields as if rising from beneath the earth. Others swore they saw two figures wandering near the family plot, their steps uneven, their bodies swaying as though joined in some unnatural rhythm. Whether born of imagination, guilt, or truth, these stories grew with each telling, until the tale of Lydia and Clara became inseparable from the land itself. The sisters, bound in life and bound in death, were remembered not as children, but as a warning, their fate carried into every whispered story told by firelight across Yazoo County. The legend of the Hargrove sisters did not end with the soil that covered their bodies, but instead seeped into the marrow of Yazoo County, becoming part of the land's uneasy memory. Farmers working their fields claimed that when the wind swept across the delta, it carried a strange hum, two voices braided together, one murmuring softly as if in prayer, and the other sharp, cutting, almost mocking. Travelers passing near the Hargrove property spoke of lights flickering where no lantern burned, of shadows that seemed joined at the hip, moving across the fields long after the house had fallen quiet. Children dared each other to walk past the family plot at night, whispering that if you stood still enough, you could hear breathing beneath the earth, shallow, labored, as though the sisters had never truly found rest. Stories spread quickly, embroidered by fear, and passed from hearth to hearth until the line between memory and myth dissolved. Some insisted the sisters' pact had tethered them to the world, their souls unable to part because their bodies had been forced to share the same flesh. Others claimed their deaths were not natural but a curse, punishment for the family's sins, and that the land itself now bore the mark of their suffering. Even those who scoffed at superstition found themselves lowering their voices when the twins were mentioned, uneasy in the knowledge that the Delta was already a place where the boundary between the living and the dead often felt too thin. The legend grew until it was no longer just about the Hargroves, but about the county itself, another reminder that Mississippi's soil was thick with sorrow and secrets. The church avoided speaking of the sisters, refusing to sanctify their memory, yet their silence only deepened the fascination. Women whispered about them during sewing circles, men muttered their names while drinking by firelight, and children grew up with the story etched into their imaginations. They became symbols of everything people feared, faith corrupted by doubt, innocence twisted into horror, and family ties transformed into chains. At night, when storms gathered over the river, lightning illuminated the swamps, and some swore they saw two pale faces in the water, reflected for a heartbeat before vanishing. The legend became a mirror in which the community saw its own guilt, its own cruelty, its own hunger for explanations in a world where suffering was constant. As the years stretched on, the tale of the Siamese Sisters settled into folklore, retold with hushed intensity to children who sat wide-eyed around fires. Some versions softened Lydia into a saint, a girl whose faith was so pure that even death could not break her from her sister's side. Others darkened Clara into a figure of wrath, claiming she strangled her sister in jealousy before being dragged to hell. These retellings rarely matched the truth, but accuracy mattered little, for the story had become larger than fact. It was a cautionary tale, a ghost story, and a reminder that the Delta's history was not written only in documents and dates, but in whispers carried by the night air. The sisters were no longer just girls who lived and died in 1877. They were shadows, warnings, and omens. Visitors from outside Yazoo County often laughed at the stories, dismissing them as superstition, but even they admitted unease when they passed the Hargrove land. Horses shied away from the plot, dogs howled without cause, and travelers spoke of sudden chills that seized them when they crossed the boundary of the farm. A few dared to dig near the shallow grave, hoping to prove or disprove the tales, but each time they left shaken, muttering that the ground itself seemed to breathe. In time, even the boldest avoided the site, leaving it to overgrowth and silence, until only the legend remained to mark the place where the sisters had been laid. Their memory endured not because of monuments or records, but because of the unease that clung to the land, an unease that whispered their story into each new generation. Thus, the Hargrove sisters lived on in voices, in shadows, in the uneasy quiet of Mississippi nights. Bound by flesh in life, they became bound by story in death, their pact echoing through every retelling. The community could not let them go, for they represented something deeper than tragedy. The fear that suffering carried meaning, the dread that faith and doubt could entwine so tightly they strangled one another, and the possibility that the dead, once unsettled, never truly rested. The legend of the Siamese Sisters lingered like the damp air of the Delta, inescapable, heavy and eternal.